As you guys know, I talk about RBI baseball all the time on this channel. Of course, this is because some of my fondest childhood memories come from playing this game over and over again. The thing is, though, that we don't usually talk a lot about its Japanese predecessor. Yakyuu Family Stadium, or Famista for short, is actually an extremely important baseball game, one that most of us tend to ignore. Now, that might be because Famista is, a really old game. After all, the game originally came out in Japan in December 1986. You know how old that is? You know how long ago that is? That's back when the Mets were actually good. I mean, it might be because it's a Japanese game, but seriously, there's a lot of really interesting things going on in the Japanese version that you've probably never thought about. And it turns out, of course, that this is actually one of the most popular Famicom games of all time. The first time you see the Japanese version, you'll think it's the same as the North American version of the game. Sure, the players have different names, all written in hiragana, but surely they must be similar to what we know about in RBI baseball, right? Well, it's kind of similar, but not exactly. For instance, Famista only has 10 teams, even though Japan's professional baseball leagues had 12 teams back in 1986. And one of those 10 teams, the Team N, is a fictional team that's based on other Namco properties. You see, it wasn't really until Famista 88 that Namco was able to finally use real team names. The company technically was not supposed to use actual player names in 1986 either, but they kind of ignored that for the first two versions of the game at least. And it's actually kind of fun to figure out who's who. So just so you know, I recently succeeded in beating the game, which means winning 9 games in a row. I used Team G, the Giants, which supposedly have no relation to the Yomiuri Giants in real life. Of course, we actually had some names that would have been recognizable to Japanese baseball fans at the time, like this leadoff hitter named Matsumoto, who was clearly one of the fastest players in the entire game. That is almost certainly Tadashi Matsumoto, an outfielder who stole 39 bases in 1986 with a .325 on-base percentage for the Giants. I don't have enough information to say for sure that he hit leadoff for the Giants, but I'm not really sure that it matters. It's clearly him in the game. And he's not the only easily recognizable player. Thing is, if you were a Japanese baseball fan in 1986 and you played this game, you would have recognized almost all of the names. For example, you've got this power hitter named Kuromate who hits third, and he's pretty reliable provided that you actually can hit the ball with him. That, of course, was Warren Cromartie, and seriously, look at how awesome his 1987 Calbee baseball card is. I feel like we really got the short end of the stick in North America. These 1980s Calbee cards look a lot like Stadium Club. Anyway, almost all of the star hitters are in this game, and not just on the Giants. There are some names that you would recognize, in fact, even if you didn't really follow Japanese baseball all that closely. For example, the guy hitting third on Team T is named Basu, which should sound like an unusual Japanese name to you. That would be the famous Hanshin Tigers slugger Randy Bass, the Triple Crown winner in 1985. Team F seems to be a composite of different teams. The third hitter, Ochiai, is probably Hiromitsu Ochiai, who was with Lotte in 1986. And yet their fourth hitter, Lee, is almost certainly Leon Lee, who was with the Yakult Swallows in 1986. Anyway, we could play this game all day. Now, the simple way to understand it is that the players are there, though they're kind of mixed up. But the other thing you need to know is that the presence of guys who were just like real-life Japanese star players is not really the only thing that made Famista so popular back in those days. The thing that we overlook about this game is that the design of the game itself and the way that it used its internal memory was completely revolutionary. So as you probably know, the first Famicom baseball game was Baseball, which came out back in December 1983. In retrospect, Baseball is an incredibly simple game, and it's also really slow. There are only 2 screen views similar to the arcade game, and the game feels really limited and clunky. Most famously, you cannot control your own fielders, most likely because you would have to control everybody at once. Now, this wasn't just a problem with the first Nintendo baseball game, by the way. The arcade version had similar limitations, though at least the arcade version had a third viewpoint. When you're fielding, you can see behind the pitcher when the ball is hit. Anyway, Sega came out with a game called Champion Baseball in 1983 in the arcade that had a very similar limitation. This game feels even more primitive than the NES baseball game, and by the way, this is on the SG-1000, the predecessor to the Sega Master System. This looks and feels, though, like an Atari 2600 game, and it's miles away from the quality of Nintendo's original baseball. Don't worry if you've never heard of this game. Again, it was only released in Japan on Sega's SG-1000. And just like with Nintendo's baseball, you don't actually control your fielders, you only control which base they throw the ball to. Now, Sega did come out with another baseball game for home consoles in 1985, and this is a game that was only released in Japan. This is where things get really confusing, since there's a different Sega Master System game that came out in North America in 1987 that uses the exact same name. This game was the Sega MyCard version of Great Baseball. It is completely different from the cartridge version of Great Baseball, which had a different name in Japan. Anyway, as you can see here, it was released by Sega in 1985. That means that it predates Famista by a little bit over a year. Now, this game should look familiar to you. This is basically a clone of Nintendo's baseball with very few differences, if any. The game is painfully slow, and of course the fielding is all automatically done by the computer except for throwing to different bases, which is where you come in. Now, I really think that the reason why these games did not let the player field is because nobody had thought of a way to show the player, like the human player, which guy they were controlling. That might seem kind of funny in hindsight, but you have to realize that video games in 1985 and 1986 were still a long way away from what we would consider classic home video games. And this really is where Famista stands out as being revolutionary. When you look inside Famicom games that came out in 1983, you will notice that they are pretty simple. All Famicom and NES games have at least two chips. One is the PRG, or the program chip, and the other is the CHR chip, which stores information on how the sprites and the backgrounds look. So in the case of the original baseball, the PRG holds 16 kilobytes of data, and the CHR holds 8 kilobytes. That's important to know because the Famicom hardware could only support up to 32 kilobytes of PRG data and 8 kilobytes of CHR data. So as a result of this limitation, the first Famicom games are extremely simple. In fact, most of the original games didn't even have scrolling, just like that baseball game. This port of Donkey Kong was the first Famicom game to be released, and you probably already know what it looks like. You jump around and avoid flying objects, and you stay on the same screen until you get to a certain point. Every single level is like this. It's a puzzle you're supposed to solve on a single screen with no screen scrolling at all. This port of Nintendo's Popeye arcade game also came out in July 1983. This game is a little bit more entertaining than Donkey Kong, but it's the same thing. Everything happens on a single screen. Not surprisingly, these games also have very basic chipsets. Like baseball, Donkey Kong has 16 kilobytes of PRG and 8 of CHR, and Popeye is exactly the same. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I don't think that any other retro gaming Nintendo YouTuber has said before, and maybe they have, I just haven't watched their video. If these Nintendo games had remained on this level, you know, like screen by screen sort of Donkey Kong type games, nobody would care about the system. It would have been an absolute failure. In fact, the NES would never have come to North America, and the system likely would have been an utter failure in Japan. The thing about that video game collapse of 1983 is that it happened not just because there were tons of clones of games that already existed. No, the problem is that by and large, the majority of the games back then really sucked. But all of that gradually started to change. This is Devil World, a Nintendo R&D 1 creation that came out in October 1984. I'm fairly confident that this is the first Famicom game to have any kind of screen scrolling, and the cool thing is that it scrolls in all 4 directions. Of course, it's pretty clear that whoever designed this game was on drugs, but that's another story. Anyway, the Devil World box art looks cool and all, though it obviously never came out in North America because our Christian overlords would have had a fit. And once again, this was a small game with that same 16 kilobyte PRG and 8 kilobyte CHR. But the key about Devil World, aside from, the exorcism references and the really bizarre and satanic gameplay, is that the screen could move. That made it different from everything that was out there for home video game consoles. Now, the next thing that happened was a revolution in design that wound up turning the Famicom into one of the most dominant video game systems ever. This is Ninja Jajamaru-kun, a Jaleco game that came out in 1985 that you've clearly never heard of. I think that you're like a ninja killing like ghosts or something like that. I don't know. I'm not sure I really care that much. Anyway, the side-to-side scrolling is neat and all, but it's not the software that makes this release important. No, it's the hardware. The game art looks almost like something from a Scooby-Doo episode, so it's a little bit corny. However, the chipset has a few things that we have not seen before. You see, the chips in this game featured the same 16 kilobytes of PRG, but this time also 16 kilobytes of CHR. Now, I just told you that the Famicom could only handle 8 kilobytes of CHR. The ability to draw from bigger chips than the system could technically handle was made possible by something called a mapper. If I understand this right, these two extra chips serve as the mapper, something that basically organizes the 16 kilobytes of CHR into 8-bit chunks that the system could handle at once. Now, anyway, don't quote me on all of that, right? I'm not a programmer, I'm not an engineer. If I was, I probably wouldn't be making all these videos, right? I'm just a baseball fan who's interested in trying to figure out how the Famista works in a way that I can understand. Anyway, this particular mapper is referred to in the emulation and NES development communities as Mapper 87, even though this actually was the first mapper developed. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these mappers out there, even though most of them are kind of clones of each other. The NES development wiki has tons of information about Mapper 87. You can go read it and figure it out on your own, since personally I barely understand this. This particular mapper was used in a handful of games created by companies like Jaleco and Konami, and all of these are early Famicom titles. And like I told you, there are so many of these mappers out there that it will make your head spin. Of course, this is not a video about the hardware of the NES, but if you want to understand why Famista was so revolutionary, you really need to understand at least at a basic level how the hardware worked. And those of you who are engineers and who are tired of hearing me say false information and stupid stuff, you can go ahead in the comments and let me know what's really going on. Now, the thing that made Famista amazing is the fact that it combined the best of both of these worlds. So it had that extra memory mapping technique that allowed programmers to use, more space in the cartridge, and combine that with the concept of screen scrolling. This is the most famous Famicom game of all time, of course, Super Mario Bros. This game basically invented the concept of a side-scroller. It was fast and interesting, and it makes you feel like you're on a journey, not just a character stuck in some kind of box. Super Mario Bros. Was a launch title in North America, but it didn't come out in Japan until September 1985, which is over 2 years after the Famicom was first released. Its chipset and PCB board should look familiar to you by now. It's the same as those really old games. Super Mario Bros. Had 32 kilobytes of PRG, which was double Donkey Kong and Popeye, but still only had 8 kilobytes of CHR. And since it was small enough to meet the technical specifications of Famicom hardware, it did not have a mapper. It had what we call mapper number 0. By the way, Super Mario Bros. Is an excellent example of what you can do if you focus less on using tons and tons of space for your program and more on figuring out creative ways to work with the little space that you have. It is a fantastic game for a game that was that small, and honestly, it's better than side-scrolling PC games that were released 5 or 6 years later. Now, when the first previews of Famista were published in Japanese video game magazines in early November 1986, the top game at the time was Namco's port of Super Xevious, an arcade game from a few years earlier. Super Xevious is one of those old vertical space shooting games, sort of like 1942. This is a genre that was extremely popular at the time. It's kind of cool because you have two different planes of combat. You got the enemies in the sky and also the enemies on the ground. Honestly though, I'm just not a fan of this kind of game, and I find it pretty boring overall. But the interesting thing about this game is just how big its memory is. This is another Famicom game with a mapper chip. Those were pretty common by the time this was released in August 1986. This game, however, had a whopping 128 kilobytes of PRG and 32 kilobytes of CHR, a vast improvement over Donkey Kong. That's how this game gives you this really interesting 3D feeling behind the clouds. This is only possible with the memory management technique that these mappers use. And it looks like a totally different console, doesn't it? I mean, go look at those clips again and go back and look at those clips from like Donkey Kong or Popeye. The Famicom hardware had not changed at all from 1983 to 1986. And yet the people playing these games went from playing a bunch of really crappy Atari-style games, with only one screen, to games that could scroll and could provide 3D effects. They were basic effects, but they were still 3D. That's what was happening with the hardware, and this was all happening extremely quickly. Now, the magic behind Super Xevious was mapper number 206, which was a Namco specialty. Namco came out with dozens of games that used this mapper, including a lot of the North American releases under its Tengen brand. Remember, this was part of Atari Games, which Namco owned by the late 1980s. And this means that this mapper was the driving force behind some games that should sound familiar. Famista, of course, takes advantage of the best that all of these developments had to offer. The screen would scroll, unlike those earlier baseball games, and the sprites were large and attractive, even though the players did look a little bit round and chubby. This was all thanks to the evolution of Famicom cartridge hardware over time. Unlike NES Baseball, Famista focuses your attention on the pitcher-batter matchup thanks largely to the extended CHR memory. Famista also took advantage of 2 years of scrolling technology development to help the screen move along with the ball after the batter hits the ball. Unlike those earlier baseball games, the human player can actually control the fielders, and it's easy to tell which fielders you're controlling since you can only see a portion of the screen at any given time. The scrolling camera also helps prevent all of the sprites from showing up at the same time, which reduces the sprite flickering effect that impacts so many NES games. And most importantly of all, the camera is zoomed out so that you can see everything you need to see at once, which solves a problem that would start plaguing later baseball video games. And the really surprising thing about Famista is that it manages to do all of this with a PRG ROM chip that is about half the size of Super Xevious. The chips look just like those Super Xevious chips until you look at the serial numbers. Like I said before, this game uses the same mapper. This is the one we refer to these days as mapper 206. The PRG, however, is only 64 kilobytes, and that surprised me when I learned about it because it feels like the game is more advanced than that. Of course, Super Xevious wound up kind of being like a one-hit wonder, whereas Famista sold over 2 million copies in Japan. Famista in the end wound up being the 9th best-selling Famicom game of all time. Now originally I wanted to focus this video around that and title it something like the best-selling Famicom baseball game, but then I looked things up. It turns out that the original baseball on the Famicom actually sold more copies than Famista. So hey, maybe that game's a little bit better than I've given it credit. Anyway, my journey through Famista had a bunch of bumps, like the time that Team R hit 4 consecutive home runs off of me. I got really upset, and so I got my revenge on the computer, which included doing things that are kind of rare, like hitting a triple with my pitcher. Matsumoto followed up with a triple of his own, and I probably could have stretched this into an inside the park home run since he's so fast. The top of the 8th inning seemed to last forever, and we might have batted around more than once. I kinda lost track. In the end, we won that game 24-8 for our 8th victory in a row, and it was called after 8 innings because of the 10-run rule. But it wasn't all a walk in the park, that's for sure. I made my share of mistakes, and to be honest, I really started tilting near the end. In other words, if you're going to play Famista, you don't want to play too much of this in one sitting. It will do a lot of strange things to your sanity if you try it that way. In 1986, the Seibu Lions won the Japan series in dramatic fashion. And seriously, have you ever seen anybody try to rob a home run like that? Anyway, it's probably fitting that our final game came against Team L, which represents the Seibu Lions. That game was the first time that I've ever lined out into a triple play in all of my years of playing this game. And since you only have 4 pitchers in the game and fatigue actually matters, our starters could barely manage to go 3 innings by this point without throwing up a bunch of meatballs. However, we were able to get some amazing offense from some key lineup slots, even if our pitcher was thrown out trying to stretch it this time. In the end, we won the whole thing with a strikeout in the bottom of the 9th inning. And that gave us that special music as well as the final score. This is the screen that we've all been waiting to see. Now, if you're really interested in beating Famista for yourself, I do have a couple of pointers for you. And no, this isn't the sort of like get good bro stuff that most people are going to tell you. There are a few tricks I can give you that will actually help you win the game. First of all, you should know that I spend way too much time frustrated on offense swinging at pitches I should have just let go by. Even though a lot of these actually were strikes, the real key to success on offense is to be patient, since the computer will always throw a lot of junk. Just like in real baseball, the key to success is to take pitches and make the pitcher throw you strikes. The better you get at taking pitches, the easier pitch recognition will be, and that is the key to getting solid base hits with people like your pitcher. There are also a couple of other things that you can theoretically do. Well, at least I tried them out. Most of these come from really old issues of biweekly Famitsu magazine. Take this one, for example. In theory, if you bunt the ball foul the right way and push the start button at the exact right time, you can trigger a glitch. Do it right and the pitcher will then pitch from first base. I tried this, but I had a real hard time getting the bunt to go foul. And when it did go foul, I couldn't get the game to pause at the right time. I'm going to conclude that this tip was actually just a rumor. I'm just not seeing how this is possible. So if you've ever made this happen, if you know how to do it, like let me know how, but I just can't get this to work. Anyway, there's also this kind of strange tip that tells you that you can win the final game easily by just following a certain pattern. First things first, the passcode that this tip gives you is 1098, which is incorrect. The correct passcode is actually 1089, but unfortunately I don't have a time machine to go back and to let the magazine know that was wrong. Anyway, you're supposed to be hit by 2 beanballs in a row, then take a walk, and then anything the next guy hits is supposed to be successful. According to this screen, you can then repeat it a few times and win the final game in the first inning 10-0 while playing as the weakest team. I was able to get the first guy hit by the pitch, and sometimes the second guy as well. If you do it right, you'll then see 4 balls in a row. However, as you can see here, I had a strike right down the middle. I was patient though, and I worked the walk. And then the next guy up struck out. All in all, the trick just did not work for me. Now, after messing around with this a little bit, I think I know what's going on here. You see, the computer has a pitching pattern for every batter, and it decides which pattern to use right before the plate appearance starts. But if you're putting in, like, say, a passcode, if you're continuing the game, the pitching pattern for the first batter is always going to be the same. So if you use the passcode I gave you, 1089, and you start a new game controlling Team N, you will always have the first pitch come inside, and you'll be able to get hit by that pitch 100% of the time because you'll know it's coming, right? The thing is, though, that the second plate appearance will give you a totally random pitch sequence. So this changes for every single batter afterwards, and the only way that you can really learn them is if you're playing like on an emulator with saved states, and you save the state before every plate appearance, and then you go back afterwards and see that the pitches are the same. If you choose Team N and use that 1089 code, your first batter will always be hit by a pitch. I tried this 3 times in a row with the exact same result, and notice that the pitch comes in at the exact same angle. However, once you get to the second guy up, the pitching pattern changes. Now, it is possible to have good luck using this method. In other words, you can build up a huge first inning lead. Now, the reason that this works is not because like you've got the pattern memorized. No, it's because you're being patient at the plate. So unless, again, you want to save like your state before every single batter and go back and play it again once you know the pitch pattern, tips like the one in that magazine really are not that helpful, right? What you want to do is you want to take a lot of pitches and you want to force the computer to throw strikes. Now, there's one tip that I actually did not realize until after this project was over, and this one absolutely only applies to the Famicom version of the game. You see, Team G has a player on the bench named O. This is a guy who has 40 home runs who totally escaped my attention. The problem, of course, is that you can't see the player stats when you make a substitution. You can only see the names. Anyway, the description of Team G contains a kind of cryptic sentence about how you really need to use this guy named O as a pinch hitter. This, of course, is Sadaharu O, who was actually the Giants' manager in 1986, and notice that his Colby cards look 1,000 times better than anything Topps was printing in the 1970s. Now, the funny thing is that I played all 9 games of this project without using Sadaharu O even once, and he was on my bench the whole time. Now, I know that's on me, right? Next time that I do one of these games, I'm going to actually read about the game before doing the project, right? That's what I get for going into this thinking that I already knew everything. Anyway, for fun, I played a single game and had him come in for the guy who normally hits 8th. I thought that I had struck gold right away, but he only wound up with a double after all of this. I guess the old man just couldn't run anymore. He was really frustrating during the rest of the game and didn't even get close to another base hit. Then again, I'm guessing that the problem here is that I was a little bit over anxious. I wasn't really doing a great job lining up his bat with where the pitch was coming in. So that reminds me of playing like Legends of the Diamond and watching Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb hit a bunch of ground balls to the shortstop, right? Yeah, I mean, it does happen in real life, but that's a total feels bad moment when it happens to you. Anyway, that's Famista for you. It's an all-time classic game, though you really shouldn't play too much of this in one sitting. Now, if you actually try to do a project like this for yourself, there are a few things you need to try, like getting a home run on a bunt. If you bunt the ball the right way and you see the computer run after it like this, you're always going to get an inside the park home run. And my pitcher managed to bunt for a base hit right after this too. So bunting for a home run like that is actually a pretty well-known trick in the RBI baseball community. And most people will tell you you can only do it with a left-handed batter. It is easier with a left-handed batter, but as I just showed you, you can also do it with a righty. It does take a little bit of practice, and you have to be really aggressive on the base paths to get it to work. But there's another kind of inside-the-park home run with the pitcher that you also should try to do. All right, here it is in all of its glory. Notice that this was a full swing, not a bunt. And notice that I beat that throw to the plate by a mile, even though I was using the pitcher, who is the slowest player on the team. Anyway, it is possible to do all of this. Now, I don't know that you can hit a home run over the fence with the pitcher. Maybe you can prove me wrong. I have never seen that happen in this game. But give me a try and let me know what happens. And look out for more of these Famicom baseball video game videos in the near future. There are something like 50 different baseball games on the Famicom, and I'm planning on going through every single one of them in this kind of detail one by one. So you really want to stay tuned because we're going to go places that nobody's gone before, and we're going to give you a lot of really good baseball content. Talk to you later.